A CD of chamber music provided a soothing background. A lone man was stationed in front of the rolling door. There was another door at the back of the warehouse, but it was concealed by a swath of material. Dina murmured to Toddy, "I noticed that ass Jameson brought his mistress, not his wife." Toddy shrugged. "Then he'd better be in a generous mood," she said, and Dina laughed. Bella Borden had dressed for the evening in full war paint, glistening and gleaming with every beauty product she could slather on her skin or in her hair. Bella was an aging beauty, and she had arrived on the arm of her latest husband, a man just old enough to keep her from being a figure of fun. She greeted Anna Clausen as if they were very old friends. She didn't notice the gleam in Anna's eyes as she threw her arms around Anna's neck. When the guests had had a few glasses of wine and a bacon-wrapped fig or two, Toddy took the microphone and tapped on it. The courteous silence was relaxed, a result of the alcohol, Toddy thought. I'm so glad you're all here tonight," she said sincerely. "Each of you is our very special guest, and we hope you'll join us in our effort to save this wonderful planet. We chose this warehouse to meet to emphasize our commitment to reclaim buildings that are still usable, buildings that for tax reasons are allowed to fall down and become blights on the landscape. Throwing this dinner here cost a sixth of what it would have cost at a hotel. That's money we can use to scrub our planet clean." There was a murmur of comment. Mark, standing at the side of the crowd and keeping a sharp eye, could tell that the tone was contemptuous. Toddy's smile never wavered as she met Bella Bordelon's scornful face. If anything, it brightened. "She's thinking of the bunnies," Mark whispered to Dina. "Do you think there's any way they'll be talked around?" "No," said Dina, and she smiled a little herself. "Before we serve your excellent meal, supplied by the great Anna Clausen today," Toddy said, "we'd like to show you a film that's made a huge impact on our lives. We hope it'll do the same for you. I have a feeling it will." And the young man in charge of the movie equipment began to show an inconvenient truth. At least the audience was quiet during the showing, but by the time the showing came to an end, the guests were hungry and restless, and their applause was lukewarm. James Jeffrey Jameson was not being subtle about pawing his mistress, and she was struggling to keep a pleasant expression on her face. She wasn't drunk. She'd been quite careful in her wine intake. Bella Borden and her husband were more decorous. Bella was whispering to George Puffman, who'd been seated next to her, and Bella's young man fell deep in conversation with Selim, the bodyguard. As a whole, the audience of environmental offenders didn't seem to be showing the contrite attitude that Toddy had yearned for. But she smiled and persevered. "My husband Mark, the host of this wonderful event, will be passing among you with the proverbial hat, hoping you'll contribute generously to our cause." "We're hungry," said George Puffman. "I'll write a damn check if it means you bring the food." "Of course, Mr. Puffman," Toddy said. There was not a wave of check writing. In fact, as Mark passed through with a battered pork pie hat, which Dina had pronounced highly symbolic, the contributions came lightly, and when Toddy rifled through the collected checks, looking at the amounts, her sweet face fell. Mark was angry on her behalf, though he hadn't expected great things. The guests had been selected for their poor track record on environmental issues, and they were running true to form. Toddy raised her hand in the air in the prearranged signal. She picked up the microphone for the last time. "I'm sorry you didn't come through for the cause," she said sadly. "I had hoped this evening with Mr. Gore would persuade you. We planned our party so carefully to give you all a chance to redeem yourselves." Bella Bordelon called, "I don't need your redemption. I've done nothing for which I need to apologize." "Give 'em hell, Bella," said Puffman. Jameson echoed the sentiment. His mistress, who was a canny young woman, looked around at the white-clad waitstaff. They'd moved to form a loose circle around the cluster of tables. She rose and excused herself quietly to go to the powder room. Instead, she walked as swiftly as her feet would carry her over to the big rolling door. The sharp-eyed waiter guarding it glanced at Toddy, a question on his face. Toddy gave a tiny nod of assent, and he rolled the door open just wide enough to permit the young woman to exit. She stepped outside with an unmistakable air of relief, and began walking quickly through the deserted warehouses on her high-heeled sandals as the door rolled closed behind her. She may have sensed someone following her for a few blocks, and she took care not to run. But no one else in the warehouse seemed to pick up on whatever had spooked Jameson's mistress. In fact, the guests were beginning to look more and more restless and angry. Since you don't seem to feel the need to help the Earth, we've decided to give the United States a present before we leave these shores, Toddy said, her voice sad. I'd hoped we'd have a huge sum to hand to the former vice president, and I'd hoped we'd all serve you a great meal and you'd get to go home replete with food and virtue, but now I'm afraid that won't be happening. No food? Bellowed Puffman. We'll eat, Toddy said gently. See my teeth? All that unexpected question. At that unexpected question, all the guests stared. Toddy Makepeace shucked her vintage Dior and parted her lips to show her white teeth. And the assembled crowd watched as they grew longer and sharper. Then Toddy bent over and jerked and spasmed, and when it was over, she was a huge wolf. There was an appalling and unbelieving hush. Then Toddy leapt on Bella Borden and ate her up. It was a noisy process. Mark became an even larger wolf. Dina and Purcell stayed in human form, but their incisors extended and became needle-like. Dina yanked Puffman from his table, drew him into a lover-like embrace with superhuman strength, and sank her fangs into his neck. Purcell enjoyed the same pleasure with Puffman's bodyguard, Selim, whose gun never left its holster. Most of the guests were still frozen in their seats for a few important seconds, unable to believe the sights in front of their eyes. But that didn't last long. The guests that tried to run provided the most entertainment for the serving staff, some of whom had changed into animal form and some who turned out to have fangs like the Colvilles. Marchesa took special pleasure in hunting down Jameson. She said something just before she bit him, something that might have been white meat. The sounds in the old warehouse reached a crescendo of screams and growls and moans, broken by the occasional howl and crack of bone. This quite drowned out the chamber music. A good time was had by all, at least by all the survivors. After it was over and the replete staff had heaped what remained of the guests in the middle of the warehouse and had hosed themselves down outside and donned clean clothes, Anna Clausen left with the truck of excellent meals. She would take them to the homeless shelter downtown so the food wouldn't be wasted. 2 of the staff went with Anna to help distribute the meals. 3 others returned to the parking garage to begin ferrying the cars left there to an automobile graveyard Purcell owned, where they'd be crushed and recycled. Marchesa and her friend Paula searched the bodies for metal objects that fire might not consume. They assembled a bag full of disabled cell phones, belt buckles, jewelry, and the like. These identifiable objects would be tossed into one of the cars before it made its final trip through the crusher. The cash from the bodies was tucked thriftily into Marchesa's pocket. Paula, whose mouth was still blood-stained, had the job of stomping skulls. She was of the fanged persuasion and terrifically strong. It would be better if the bodies were never identified, or at least not for a long time. And Paula went about her job with the enthusiasm of the young. Marchesa laughed when Jameson crunched under Paula's heel. Paula took extra care to pulverize him. The young man who played the music and started the film had a new task. He was pouring the contents of a can of accelerant around the warehouse, making sure everything would be consumed. It would take a while for the fire trucks to get here. Toddy hugged Dina and Purcell. "Thanks so much for helping out," she said, and hiccuped. She covered her mouth and giggled. "They'd had so much to drink," she said apologetically. "It was a ton of fun. Sorry it turned out that way. I really hoped they'd see the error of their ways," Purcell said, not too sincerely. "I thought about using mind control, but I decided that really would have been cheating. They needed to earn their own redemption." He tried to look righteous. "But you weren't counting on that," Mark said. Purcell shrugged. "I was pretty hungry," he admitted, with a charming smile. "It's been a long time since Dina and I hunted and drank our fill. Got to be so careful these days. Now we're full, and the environment's safer. He practically glowed with virtue and Selim's blood.